I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. Imagine you walked into a store last fall and you bought something, a physical, federally regulated device.
Right, something you buy right over the counter.
Exactly. You fill out the extensive federal forms, you pass an enhanced background check, you pay your money, and, you wait months for approval.
Oh yeah, it's not a fast process.
No, not at all. And finally, you take this safety device home and you just put it on a shelf. Now imagine waking up today and finding out a new law has just passed.
And this law says you now have exactly 90 days to take that exact same device from that exact same shelf and hand it over to the federal government.
Right, and the alternative to handing it over, well, it's severe.
Yeah, it really is. Because the moment that 90-day clock hits zero, continued possession of that device automatically turns you into a federal felon.
Which is wild to think about. The object sitting on your shelf hasn't changed at all. Your behavior hasn't changed.
But the legal reality governing that object has just shifted entirely beneath your feet and in a very, very compressed window of time.
That is the staggering reality on the table for millions of Americans right now. Which brings us to the focus of today's deep dive.
Right, the HERE Act.
Yes,
Yeah.
the Help Empower Americans to Respond Act. Officially, this is House Resolution 90208 of the 119th Congress, which was introduced recently on June 8th, 2026.
And at its core, this bill proposes a complete nationwide ban on firearm suppressors.
Yeah. And because of the nature of this topic, I mean, the temperature in the room goes up the second the word firearm is introduced.
Oh, absolutely. People have deeply ingrained, deeply emotional reactions to the regulation of these devices.
Okay, let's unpack this, but let's do it with complete neutrality.
Right.
If you are tuning in, you should know right off the bat that we are not here to endorse a viewpoint,
Yeah.
left or right. We're not taking a political side.
We're really just here to look at the facts.
Exactly. We are going to rigorously examine the mechanics, the history, and the core scientific arguments surrounding this legislation. We are objectively exploring the claims and the counterclaims presented in our source material regarding a highly charged, incredibly impactful piece of proposed legislation.
And my focus today is going to be on a fascinating and honestly sometimes messy intersection. I want to look at how legislative theory, like the intentions and philosophies written into the text of a law, collides with physical reality.
Right, because the physics really matter here.
They do. When lawmakers write a bill regulating a piece of hardware, the acoustic physics of that hardware matter just as much as the political maneuvering.
So let's start with the hard text of the bill. To understand the debate, we really have to look at exactly what H.R. 9210 mandates for the millions of people it directly affects.
Right. So looking at the sources, this bill amends Title 18 of the U.S. Code, specifically Sections 921, 922, and 924.
And what does that actually do in practice?
It basically adds suppressors to a strictly prohibited category, so it makes it a federal crime to import, sell, manufacture, transfer, or even possess one.
Wow.
Yeah, it is a blanket prohibition for the general public.
But that blanket prohibition hits an immediate logistical hurdle, right? Because there are over 4 million of these devices currently owned by civilians in the United States.
Yeah, lawmakers can't just pass a bill and pretend those 4 million objects don't exist, which is where the bill's transition mechanism comes into play.
The 90-day window.
Exactly. H.R. 9208 provides a 90-day grace period for current legal owners to surrender their suppressors to local law enforcement or to authorized federal collection centers.
It sounds almost like a mandatory federal product recall, but with the massive caveat that failing to comply within 90 days instantly turns over 4 million current legal owners into felons.
Yeah, the scale of that is pretty hard to wrap your head around.
Right. I mean, how does the scale of this 90-day window compare to standard legislative rollouts? We are talking about processing over 44,000 surrendered devices every single day for 3 months just to clear the existing civilian inventory.
It's basically an unprecedented logistical scale, but what's fascinating here is that the sponsors of the bill do not frame this mechanism as a confiscation.
Really? How do they frame it?
They actively frame this as a humane, compensated public safety buyout. They have actually woven a financial mechanism into the legislation to, soften the blow.
Oh, the buyback program.
Yeah.
Our sources note this is funded through an existing federal mechanism under Title 34, Section 1152.
Right, so the government is allocating grant funds to literally buy these devices back from the owners who bring them in during that 90-day window.
But there are exemptions, right? It's not a ban for literally everyone.
Correct. The bill carves out clear exemptions. If you are a local, state, or federal law enforcement agency or a qualified military defense contractor, you are exempt.
So the ban targets the civilian population exclusively.
Exactly. So we have a mandatory surrender backed by federal grant money, enforced by the threat of felony charges, aimed squarely at civilian owners.
To understand why lawmakers are willing to pull such an aggressive legislative lever, I feel like we have to look at the catalyst. Legislation of this magnitude isn't usually drafted in a vacuum.
No, definitely not. It is usually born from a profound shock to the system.
And the history here points directly to a specific tragic event, which was the mass shooting in Virginia Beach on May 31st, 2019.
Yeah, that was a truly horrific day.
It was. And the gunman in that tragedy used a .45 caliber handgun equipped with a suppressor.
Which is a key detail, because when you read the after-action reports and the accounts from survivors in the building that day, a deeply unsettling pattern emerges.
What kind of pattern?
Well, a significant number of the people who were there reported that they did not immediately recognize the sound they were hearing as gunfire.
And that detail, the auditory confusion, the delayed recognition, that is the absolute foundation of the HERE Act.
Exactly. The lawmakers driving this bill looked at those survivor accounts and identified the suppressor as the specific variable that caused the confusion.
Which brings us to Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, a Democrat from New Jersey's 12th District. She introduced this legislation in direct response to the Virginia Beach tragedy.
And she has been remarkably persistent with it.
Yeah, our sources show she introduced it first in 2019, then she brought it back in April 2021, partnering with Senator Bob Menendez.
And then pushed it again in April 2023.
Right. And now she has introduced it for a fourth time in June 2026. She's built a big coalition of co-sponsors, too, including Eleanor Holmes Norton, Adriano Espaillat, Ed Case, Johanna Hayes, Glenn Ivey, and Sean Casten.
And that level of legislative persistence tells you this is not just opportunistic political theater.
No, they clearly believe in this.
Yeah, this coalition is acting on a sincerely held belief. They are trying to solve what they genuinely perceive as a critical vulnerability in public safety.
And they are operating on the theory that the sound of a gunshot is not just noise, right? It is a crucial public warning system.
Exactly. The acronym of the bill itself actually spells that out. Help empower Americans to respond.
The underlying logic being that the deafening, unmistakable crack of a firearm is the alarm bell that tells bystanders to run, to lock doors, to take cover.
Right. It is the immediate signal that alerts first responders. So the sponsor's argument is pretty straightforward.
Which is that any device engineered to soften it is bad.
Yeah, any device designed to alter or degrade that specific acoustic signature is, in their eyes, effectively disabling a public safety alarm.
So to this coalition of lawmakers, whatever recreational or hearing protection benefits a suppressor might offer to, say, a target shooter at a range,
those benefits just do not outweigh the risk of someone hesitating during an active shooter event because the gunfire sounded muffled.
They also heavily lean on the concept of regulatory consistency. I mean, suppressors are not treated like standard rifle scopes or carrying straps anyway.
No, they've been aggressively regulated for over 90 years.
Right, under the National Firearms Act of 1934. If you want to buy a suppressor right now, you have to submit fingerprints to the FBI, undergo a rigorous background check, pay a $200 federal tax stamp.
And then wait months for the ATF to process the paperwork and add you to a national registry.
Exactly. And the sponsors use that historical context to their advantage. They argue that the United States government has already recognized for almost a century that these devices require stringent control.
So they frame the HERE Act not as inventing a new category of concern, but as taking a 90-year-old category of concern to its ultimate logical conclusion.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I want to push back a bit on the core philosophy driving this bill.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the overarching goal is saving seconds for first responders, and if the premise is that seconds equal lives, does this legislation assume that the delayed reaction in Virginia Beach was purely a mechanical issue with the gun?
As opposed to what?
As opposed to the chaotic nature of human perception during an emergency. I mean, when human beings are subjected to sudden, intense trauma, our brains often go into a state of shock. We experience something psychologists call normalcy bias.
Oh, right, where we try to normalize the abnormal.
Yes. If you were sitting in a quiet municipal office building and you suddenly hear a massive percussive bang down the hall, your brain does not immediately leap to, oh, That is a .45 caliber handgun.
Yeah, your brain searches for a benign explanation first.
Exactly. You think a filing cabinet tipped over or construction equipment fell. It takes vital seconds for the human brain to process that extreme violence has suddenly entered a safe space.
And that represents a crucial dividing line in this debate. Are we legislating the physical tool, or are we inadvertently trying to legislate human psychology?
Right. Did the survivors in Virginia Beach hesitate because the suppressor mechanically erased the sound of the gunshot? Or did they hesitate because human beings naturally freeze and attempt to contextualize sudden, deafening noises in places where they absolutely do not expect to hear them?
Well, the sponsors of the HERE Act are betting everything on the mechanical explanation. They believe the alteration of the sound by the device is the primary culprit.
Which brings us to the most critical pivot in our deep dive.
Yeah.
Because the entire moral and logical framework of H.R. 9208 rests on one highly specific physical assumption about how a suppressor operates.
Which is that they assume these devices actually silence firearms.
Right. It assumes they successfully muffle gunfire enough to truly delay human auditory recognition. So we had to test that foundational premise against the cold, hard science of acoustic physics.
And when you look at the acoustic data in our sources, you run headfirst into a massive disconnect between perception and reality.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
The central assumption of this legislation appears to be heavily influenced by media portrayals. I mean, we've all seen the movies.
Oh, for sure. A spy screws a cylinder onto the barrel of a pistol, pulls the trigger, and all you hear is a tiny, stealthy pef-t sound.
Right. It's so quiet that the guards in the next room don't even look up from their coffee.
But I dug into the decibel data provided in our sources, and the numbers are completely incompatible with that cinematic portrayal.
Completely incompatible.
An unsuppressed gunshot from a standard firearm generates sound pressure around 160 to 165 decibels. That is astronomically loud. That is in the realm of a jet engine taking off.
Yeah, it's deafening.
And when you attach a high-end suppressor to that exact same firearm, it only drops the sound down to roughly 135 to 140 decibels.
And to understand why it's still that loud, we really need to look at how the device actually works.
Okay, break it down for us.
So a firearm suppressor functions very similarly to the muffler on your car. Inside that metal cylinder is a series of baffles. When a gun is fired, high-pressure expanding gases propel the bullet down the barrel. And when those gases hit the atmosphere, they create a massive concussive pop. This is the muzzle blast.
Got it.
The baffles in a suppressor trap and slow down those expanding gases, acting like a series of airlocks, which cools the gas and reduces that specific pop.
But reducing the muzzle blast doesn't silence the bullet itself.
Right. And that is the physical reality that movies ignore. A standard bullet travels faster than the speed of sound.
So it's breaking the sound barrier.
Exactly. As it rips through the air, it breaks the sound barrier, creating a miniature sonic boom. It's a sharp, violent, supersonic crack.
Wow.
Yeah, and a suppressor only works on the gases at the barrel. It does absolutely nothing to stop the sonic boom created by the bullet in flight.
Wait, really? Nothing at all?
Nothing. Even if you use specialized subsonic ammunition that travels slower than the speed of sound, you still have the mechanical clatter of the gun's action and the remaining gas escaping.
Which brings us back to those decibel numbers.
Yeah.
Because 140 decibels is not a whisper.
No, not even close.
According to audiology standards, 140 decibels is the exact threshold where instant permanent damage to human hearing occurs. It is the acoustic equivalent of standing directly next to an active pneumatic jackhammer.
And a jackhammer operating in your immediate vicinity is a violent, percussive, overwhelming auditory event.
Yeah, you are jumping out of your skin if that starts up next to you.
Exactly. It is disruptive and startling. A suppressed gunshot does not sound like a movie sound effect. It sounds like a gunshot, just one that is slightly less likely to instantly rupture the eardrums of the person pulling the trigger.
This creates a monumental dilemma for the lawmakers pushing the HERE Act, doesn't it? If the data from a decibel meter contradicts the premise of the legislation, how do lawmakers reconcile that?
It's tough, because if a suppressed firearm is still producing the decibel equivalent of a jackhammer, then the central factual premise of H.R. 9208 is deeply flawed.
Scientifically speaking, the public warning system has not been erased. It has just been lowered from catastrophic jet engine down to incredibly loud and painful.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this legislation represents the ultimate challenge in modern policymaking.
How so?
We are witnessing a collision between undeniable emotional trauma and the uncompromising laws of physics. The lawmakers pushing this bill are operating from a place of profound empathy for victims.
Yeah, they read the survivor testimonies from Virginia Beach.
Exactly. They see the pain of people saying, I didn't know it was a gun. And their immediate, deeply human impulse is to pass a law to ensure no one ever experiences that confusion again.
And it is a fundamentally noble impulse. They want to save lives. But the law they have written targets a physical piece of hardware, and it demands that the hardware perform in a way that acoustic physics simply does not allow.
Right. You cannot ban a device for being silent when the data proves it is as loud as heavy construction equipment.
And the stakes for this disconnect between theory and reality are massive. We are not talking about a minor administrative rule change here.
No, definitely not. If this law passes, an acoustic misunderstanding, essentially a myth born from Hollywood sound design, becomes the legal justification for the largest single-day felony creation event in the history of American firearms legislation.
4 million people facing a 90-day countdown, all based on the premise that a 140 decibel explosion is actually a silent threat.
That is why analyzing the mechanics of a law alongside the science of the object it regulates is so vital.
Yeah, because when a government mandates the surrender of millions of privately owned, highly regulated items under the direct threat of federal felony charges, the underlying justification really has to be unassailable.
It does. If the factual foundation of the law rests on a myth, even a myth believed with the utmost sincerity and the best of intentions, it creates a profound crisis of legislative legitimacy.
To bring all these threads together, we started today by examining the uncompromising legal mechanisms of the HERE Act. We looked at how H.R. 9208 amends Title 18 to institute a sweeping prohibition.
And we looked at the sheer logistical magnitude of giving 4 million legal owners a 90-day window to surrender their property to a federally funded buyback program or face immediate felony charges.
Then we explored the profound, tragic history that motivated the bill's persistent sponsors. We looked at the Virginia Beach shooting, the very real trauma of the survivors, and the resulting legislative philosophy that views the sound of gunfire as an essential public warning system.
And finally, we collided that philosophy with the cold data of acoustic physics.
Right, detailing how a suppressor uses baffles to capture expanding gases, but cannot stop the supersonic crack of a billet.
The physical reality that a suppressed weapon still produces roughly 140 decibels of sound pressure raises the difficult question of whether this massive legislative action is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of science.
Which brings us to the end of our dive.
I do want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you digest all of this, though.
Oh, please do.
If a sweeping piece of federal legislation, one carrying life-altering criminal penalties for millions of citizens, is constructed around a specific technical understanding of how a device operates, what happens to the integrity of our legal system if the public's understanding of that technology has been entirely distorted by pop culture and movies?
Wow. That's a great question.
Right. In the end, does the law reflect the physical reality of the tool in our hands, or does it merely reflect society's fear of the myth we watch on a screen?
So, what does this all mean? It means that staying well-informed requires looking past the emotionally charged title of a bill and measuring its claims against the hard, unyielding realities of the physical world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information around you, and the next time you see a product sitting quietly on a shelf, remember just how fast the legal reality governing it can change. Until next time.
I want you to imagine just for a second what happens when a piece of national legislation that carries a potential 10-year federal prison sentence is built almost entirely on a Hollywood sound effect.
Yeah, it sounds like the setup to a really dark joke. I mean, but when you actually look at the mechanics of how policy gets drafted, it's kind of wild how cinematic fiction just bleeds right into statutory reality.
It really does. So today we are taking a very close look at H.R. 9208, also known as the HERE Act.
Right, the HERE Act.
And this is a bill that's aimed at implementing a nationwide ban on firearm suppressors. We have got a huge stack of sources for you today. We've got raw congressional bill text, acoustic and decibel data, occupational health statistics.
Yeah, plus the official records from the ATF and the National Shooting Sports Foundation.
Exactly. And our mission today is very simple. We are leaving the politics at the door. We are not taking any sides here. No left, no right. We are just here to objectively test the foundational assumptions of the HERE Act against the raw physics and the statistical reality in our source material.
Right, we're basically just testing the text of the legislation against the physical reality of the actual devices it's trying to regulate. Because that's the only way you can understand exactly how the math and legal statutes actually align.
Okay, let's unpack this because, you really cannot understand the legislation without first understanding the physical reality of the device itself. And honestly, that starts with the vocabulary.
Definitely. The vocabulary is huge here.
Right. Like I was looking through the mechanical diagrams in our sources, and the whole debate seems to hinge on this fundamental misunderstanding of what these things actually do.
Because the public perception is completely shattered by the raw decibel data. I mean, let's just look at the baseline. So an unsuppressed shot from a standard centerfire rifle.
And real quick, centerfire just means a rifle where the firing pin strikes the center of the cartridge, right?
Exactly, which is, the vast majority of modern firearms. So that unsuppressed shot registers at roughly 160 to 165 decibels right at the muzzle.
Okay, and just to anchor that for you, a normal conversation is what, about 60 decibels?
Yeah, about 60. And a lawnmower sits around 90 decibels.
Wow. So hitting 165 is a massive, violent acoustic event.
It's massive. And according to the acoustic data, a suppressor reduces that sound profile by about 20 to 35 decibels.
Okay.
And, the exact reduction fluctuates a bit. It depends on the specific firearm, the ammo velocity, and obviously the internal volume of the suppressor itself.
Right. So doing the math there, if you take a 165 decibel gunshot and you subtract, let's say, a generous 25 decibels,
Right.
you are still left with an event registering at 140 decibels. And this is where that Hollywood myth just completely falls apart. Because 140 decibels is not silent.
Not at all.
I mean, that is the equivalent of standing 100 feet away from a commercial jet engine at takeoff.
Or operating a pneumatic jackhammer. It's incredibly loud. The movies show, an assassin threading a metal tube onto a pistol, and suddenly the gun just makes a tiny click, or like a little puff of air.
Yeah, the classic laser gun sound, pew, pew.
Right. But that is a pure cinematic fabrication. It's totally made up.
Because a silenced gunshot, so to speak, causes instantaneous physical pain. Like, if someone fires a suppressed weapon in an enclosed space, say a hallway or an office building, it is physically impossible not to notice it.
Exactly. Your ears will ring.
You will flinch. You will physically feel the pressure wave hitting your chest.
Yeah, so it raises the question, why do people, including the lawmakers drafting this, think these devices make guns silent?
Right. Where did that even come from?
Well, the historical sources trace this back to the early 20th century, to an inventor named Hiram Percy Maxim. When he created the commercial version of this device, he marketed it under a specific trade name. He called it the Maxim silencer.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's just a pure marketing buzzword just to sell a product.
Exactly. A brand name that stuck.
Even though the actual engineering terms are suppressor or muffler. And what's incredibly ironic to me is that Maxim also invented the car muffler.
Yes, it's the exact same technology.
Right. And if you look at the text of the bill itself, H.R. 9208 actually regulates them as mufflers, which is scientifically accurate.
It is, because it relies on identical fluid dynamics to a car exhaust. Inside a suppressor, there are a series of metal baffles, which are basically just small chambers.
Okay.
And when the bullet passes through, those chambers trap the expanding gases from the gunpowder explosion. It gives that high-pressure gas a place to sort of expand and cool down before hitting the open atmosphere.
So it manages the blast wave, but it does not magically erase the sound of the mechanical action or the sonic boom of the bullet breaking the sound barrier.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how this physical reality interacts with the stated purpose of the legislation. I mean, the bill is literally the Help Empower Americans to Respond Act, the HERE Act. The foundational premise of the text is the idea that if a bad actor uses one of these devices, the public won't hear the shots, they won't be warned, and they won't know to run or respond.
But that premise completely collapses under the weight of a simple decibel meter. I mean, if the warning system is a sound as loud as a jet engine, the warning system is fully intact. You are still going to react.
Yeah, the physical device the bill is trying to ban just does not possess the capabilities the bill assumes it has.
Okay, so this brings up a huge question for me. If these devices don't make guns silent, if they still sound like a jackhammer, why are millions of people buying them?
Well, the audiology data in our sources points straight to occupational health.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So the threshold for permanent hearing damage from sustained continuous noise is about 90 decibels. But the threshold for instantaneous damage, meaning one single sudden impulse that permanently damages your hearing in a fraction of a second, is 140 decibels.
Right, and we need to look closely at how those decibels are measured, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a logarithmic scale, not a linear one.
Exactly. An increase of 10 decibels isn't just 10% louder. It actually represents a tenfold increase in acoustic energy.
Wow. Okay, so the jump from that 140 decibel instant damage threshold up to an unsuppressed 165 decibel shot, that is a monumental leap in sheer physical force hitting your eardrum.
Yeah, the biological mechanism here is brutal. At 165 decibels, the blast wave carries so much atmospheric pressure that it instantly bends and breaks the microscopic hair cells inside your cochlea.
Oh, man.
And those cells do not regenerate. It is permanent, irreversible hearing loss with a single trigger pull.
Which makes total sense why people use these. A suppressor takes that massive kinetic wave and diffuses the gas before it hits the atmosphere, so it's pulling the shooter right down to, or just below, that instant damage line of 140.
Right. It doesn't make it quiet. It makes it survivable for your eardrums.
It is functionally a seatbelt for your hearing. I mean, you don't wear a seatbelt because it makes a car crash pleasant. You wear it to mitigate catastrophic trauma.
That's a perfect analogy. And if you look at the real-world users of these devices, it holds up perfectly. The primary demographic consists of people exposed to gunfire regularly who just cannot isolate their hearing completely.
Like hunters.
Right, exactly. A hunter in the field needs situational awareness. They need to hear the wind, the brush, maybe other hunters nearby for safety. They can't walk through the woods wearing heavy, noise-canceling earmuffs.
So a suppressor allows them to maintain that awareness while still protecting their hearing when they actually take a shot.
Yes. And we're also talking about competitive shooters firing tens of thousands of rounds a year, range officers.
Yeah, firearms instructors who spend 8 to 10 hours a day standing next to people firing rifles.
Exactly.
And actually, looking at the text of H.R. 9208, I noticed a massive contradiction regarding those exact people. The bill explicitly exempts military and police trainers from the ban.
Oh, yeah. The government, within the text of the very bill seeking to ban these devices, actually acknowledges their legitimate occupational health function. It's wild. They exempt police and military trainers because the occupational health data proves suppressors are a vital hearing safety tool for people who spend their days on a firing line.
So the government knows it's a safety device, yet the bill criminalizes civilian instructors, range officers, and just everyday citizens making the exact same medical choice for their own hearing.
Right. The legislation simultaneously validates the primary function of the device while making it completely illegal for the general public to utilize that function.
It's a profound paradox written directly into the statute.
It really is.
Okay, so understanding that these devices are highly sought-after safety tools explains why people want them. But it doesn't explain the timing of the HERE Act.
Right, because this bill isn't new.
Exactly. I saw in the legislative history that it was introduced in 2019, 2021, and 2023. And it went absolutely nowhere. It never even got a floor vote.
It just languished in committee for years.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because suddenly, there is massive momentum behind it. And that urgency ties directly to a major shift in federal tax law passed in July of 2025, a law called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or the OBBA.
Yeah, the OBBBA. And to grasp the sheer scale of what this act did, we have to look back over 90 years to the National Firearms Act of 1934. Because for almost a century, suppressors were heavily regulated under this act. They were classified, taxed, and treated the exact same way as fully automatic machine guns.
Which is crazy. And I was looking at the historical inflation data on this. The 1934 Act imposed a $200 tax stamp on every single suppressor.
Right.
And in 1934, during the Great Depression, $200 was the equivalent of nearly $4,500 today.
Yeah, it was never designed to generate revenue. It was a punitive tax designed to be a de facto ban for the average citizen.
And beyond that massive financial barrier, the bureaucratic process was deliberately onerous. Citizens had to submit physical fingerprint cards, passport photographs, and undergo a multi-agency federal background check.
Which often resulted in a waiting period of 6 to 12 months. And sometimes it stretched well over a year just to take possession of a metal muffler for a firearm.
But then the OBBBA in July 2025 comes along and completely strips that away. It eliminated the $200 tax barrier and removed suppressors from those massive NFA wait times.
So the barrier to entry was essentially leveled overnight.
And the market response to that barrier falling was an absolute tidal wave. The numbers from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the NSSF, show that in April of 2026 alone, the ATF received over 127,000 Form 4 applications.
Wow.
And just to contextualize that for you, A Form 4 is the specific federal paperwork historically required to transfer one of these devices from a dealer to a citizen.
So over 127,000 applications in a single 30-day window.
Yeah, consumers had clearly been waiting for that tax to drop, and when it did, the floodgates opened completely.
Which brings us to the current scale of ownership. By mid-2026, the estimated number of legally owned suppressors in the United States sits at roughly 4.2 million devices.
4.2 million.
Yeah. Now, as analysts, we do have to include a vital data caveat here to ensure journalistic integrity. That 4.2 million figure is a verified estimate, but it remains an estimate.
Right, because the actual numbers are hidden, right?
Exactly. The exact real-time count of legally owned suppressors is highly confidential tax data. It is legally protected under Title 26, Section 6103 of the United States Code. And furthermore, the ATF's published statistical reports traditionally lag by several months due to processing backlogs.
So while an exact down-to-the-digit headcount isn't public, the order of magnitude over 4 million and climbing rapidly is verified across all our sources.
Yes, the sheer volume is undeniable.
So if we have an established baseline of at least 4.2 million of these devices circulating in civilian hands right now, how does a government agency structurally pull them back? I mean, let's look at the actual enforcement mechanism written into the bill.
This is where it gets really complicated.
Because the text of H.R. 9208 is framed around a, quote, humane buyback program, right? And it establishes a 90-day surrender window.
Right, and the logistics of enforcement are often where theoretical legislation collides violently with physical reality.
Yeah, just doing the brutal arithmetic on this. To process 4.2 million devices in 90 days, the government would have to process roughly 46,000 surrenders every single day, including weekends.
I mean, just consider the physical infrastructure required to handle 46,000 secure, federally documented transactions daily.
It's mind-boggling.
The bill suggests utilizing local police stations and establishing new collection centers that currently do not exist. And it proposes funding this through a grant mechanism that has never been scaled to handle this kind of volume.
Right. A local police precinct is not equipped to securely inventory, store, process compensation, and issue destruction receipts for thousands of federally regulated items a week.
No, the physical infrastructure simply is not there.
And the consequences of that logistical failure are entirely placed on the citizen. I looked at Title 18, Section 924 in our sources. If I'm doing this math right, on day 91, mere possession of a non-surrendered suppressor becomes a federal felony.
Right.
And it carries a penalty of up to 10 years in federal prison.
It fundamentally rewrites the legal status of millions of citizens overnight. Think about it. If a newly created collection center is overwhelmed and turns people away,
Which is almost guaranteed to happen.
right, or if a citizen is deployed overseas or simply doesn't watch the news and misses the 90-day window, they wake up on day 91 holding a federal felony.
For a safety device they purchased completely legally just months prior.
Exactly.
Okay, but playing devil's advocate here, because obviously the authors of the HERE Act aren't operating in a vacuum, their primary argument, like the whole driving force behind the bill, is that this removes a tactical advantage from criminals. So does the cryo data from the ATF actually support that fear?
It's the essential question to ask. But again, the statistical reality diverges sharply from the Hollywood perception. The ATF crime data is incredibly stark on this point. Firearm suppressors are used in well under 0.1% of all firearm crimes.
Wait, less than 1/10 of 1%.
Less than 1/10 of 1%. And structurally, it makes perfect sense why criminals avoid them. First of all, they're expensive pieces of equipment.
Sure.
But more importantly, they're essentially a metal tube that adds 6 to 8 inches to the end of a barrel. Adding 8 inches to a handgun makes it incredibly bulky and virtually impossible to conceal in a waistband or under a jacket.
Right, they actively hinder the operational needs of street-level crime. You can't hide it.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals the ultimate enforcement paradox of the HERE Act.
Which is that the ban exclusively targets the compliant, because they are the only ones on the list.
Bingo. The only people the government can reliably locate to enforce this 90-day countdown against are the law-abiding citizens who submitted to federal background checks, who followed the tax laws, and who filled out a Form 4.
Because a criminal holding an illegal black market device isn't on a federal registry.
Right. The entire weight of this legislation and the threat of a 10-year felony falls squarely and exclusively on the people who did everything right.
Man, so what does this all mean? I mean, when we step back and look at the entire stack of sources, the picture clarifies itself through the data.
It really does.
First, when you measure the actual decibels, the foundational premise of the bill shatters. A suppressed gunshot is still as loud as a commercial jet engine. It absolutely does not erase the public's ability to hear a warning.
Not even close.
Second, when you look at the Form 4 applications, the sudden urgency of the bill is completely explained by the massive surge in legal ownership after those 2025 tax changes.
Yeah, that 127,000 applications in 1 month really sparked this.
And third, when you look at the crime statistics and the impossible 90-day math, you realize the target of the legislation isn't the criminal element. It exclusively targets millions of heavily vetted, law-abiding citizens.
Yeah. And, as a final check on our impartiality here, this analysis wasn't about the moral intentions of the bill's sponsors. I mean, the text openly acknowledges those intentions are sincere.
Of course.
But sincerity doesn't alter physics or logistics. Our job was just to rigorously test the legislation against mathematical, acoustic, and statutory reality. And the reality is that the data simply does not support the mechanics of the bill.
It really doesn't. And, we just saw how a Hollywood-invented sound effect, literally a cinematic illusion, almost single-handedly shaped the foundation of a piece of national legislation carrying a 10-year prison sentence.
It's kind of terrifying when you put it like that.
It is, and it makes you wonder what other heavy regulations or public policies that affect our daily lives, our businesses, or our freedoms are based purely on pop culture myths rather than physical reality. It's something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning the reality behind the rhetoric, and we will see you next time. You know those classic spy movies where the assassin creeps through a shadowy hallway, right? They screw this long metal cylinder onto the barrel of their pistol, and then
Right, just this tiny, metallic whisper.
Exactly. The guard at the end of the hall doesn't even wake up. Nobody hears a thing, and the hero just slips away into the night. I mean, it's clean, it's stealthy, and it is entirely fictional.
Oh, pure Hollywood magic, 100%.
Yeah, but that fiction has kind of collided head-on with reality lately. So today we are doing a deep dive into a piece of proposed legislation. It's called H.R. 9208.
Also known as the HERE Act, right?
Right, the HERE Act, which
Right.
essentially proposes a total ban on these devices on firearm suppressors. And our mission today is to unpack how, your movie conditioning is about to clash with the actual physics of sound. Plus, we're looking at some crazy logistical hurdles and the current framework of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and this is where we really have to separate the cinema from the science.
Definitely. Real quick, though, just to lay out our sources for this deep dive, we're pulling from the official bill records on govinfo.gov, published statements from the bill's sponsor, Representative Watson Coleman, and market data from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, or the NSSF.
And before we get into the weeds here, I do want to set a really important ground rule for us. This is a highly politically charged topic. It touches on Second Amendment rights, gun control, all of that.
Oh, absolutely. It's a hot-button issue.
Right. So our goal here is not to take a side at all. We are just impartially exploring the arguments. We're taking the sincere public safety concerns of the bill's sponsors seriously, while also, rigorously examining the practical and constitutional counterarguments that the data presents.
Beautifully said. So if you're listening and you've seen silencers in 100 action movies, buckle up.
Yeah.
Because today we're going to explore how they actually work and why they're at the center of this massive legal debate right now.
Yeah, let's start with the motivation behind the HERE Act, because, it didn't just materialize out of thin air.
No, not at all. It was introduced in response to a very real, very raw tragedy, which was the mass casualty shooting in Virginia Beach.
Right, a horrific event.
Truly. And when you look at the statements from the lawmakers pushing this bill, a primary motivation stems directly from witness accounts of that day. People described having this deep, deep confusion over the sound of the gunfire.
Yeah, and the core premise of the HERE Act is that suppressors erase that warning sound of an active shooter.
Right, that it robs bystanders and first responders of the auditory cue they need to, react and take cover or locate the threat.
And validating the reality of that tragedy is essential. The confusion those people felt was very real, and the loss of life was just devastating.
Absolutely.
But when we actually look at the acoustic data, the narrative that the warning sound is erased, it gets incredibly complicated.
Okay, let's pause and unpack this,
Okay.
because if witnesses at Virginia Beach said they were genuinely confused by the sound, we can't just write that off as movie conditioning, right? There has to be some acoustic change happening.
Oh, it changes the acoustic signature, absolutely. But it doesn't eliminate the sheer volume.
Okay, so how much does this device actually muffle the sound?
Well, to understand that, we have to break down how a gun makes noise in the first place. Think about what happens when you fire a round. A firing pin strikes a primer, igniting gunpowder.
Right.
And that creates this massive high-pressure bubble of expanding gas that basically forces the bullet down the barrel.
Okay, tracking.
So when that gas bubble, which is at like 50,000 psi, when it suddenly hits the open atmospheric air at the muzzle, it creates a violent shock wave. That is the explosive boom that you hear.
Got it. So it's kind of like uncorking a champagne bottle, but magnified 1,000 times.
Yes, exactly like that.
Yeah.
A suppressor is essentially just a metal tube filled with a series of baffles or chambers.
Okay.
When you attach to the barrel, it just gives those expanding explosive gases a closed, controlled space to sort of expand, cool down, and slow down before they hit the open air.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it is literally the exact same technology, utilizing the exact same physical principles as the muffler on the bottom of your car. It just slows the gas release.
Okay, so if it's slowing the gas and muffling the pop, what is the actual decibel reality here? Because if you're listening to this and thinking, well, if it makes it quieter, it's still dangerous, we really need to put some numbers to this.
The numbers are stark. An unsuppressed gunshot from a typical rifle or pistol easily hits, 150 to 160 decibels.
Wow.
And for context, 150 decibels is the sound of a jet engine taking off while you're standing on the runway. It is instantly damaging to human hearing.
That's incredibly loud.
Right. And when you thread a suppressor onto that firearm, it brings the sound down to roughly 130 to 135 decibels.
Wait, 130 decibels? I mean, that's a jackhammer. That is a blaring air raid siren right next to your head. That is still so loud.
Yeah, it's literally the threshold of physical pain for the human ear. A suppressed gunshot in an enclosed public space is deafening.
So how does the argument that it erases the warning sound actually hold up in reality?
Well, it might sound slightly different, right? Maybe more of a sharp metallic crack than a booming roar.
Okay.
Which could definitely cause momentary confusion if your brain is desperately searching for that Hollywood movie sound effect we talked about. But the sheer volume of the warning is still massively physically present.
That makes total sense. The central premise that a suppressor makes a gun silent just doesn't align with the physics of a 130-plus decibel event.
Exactly. It's just not physically possible.
Okay, so if the physics don't match the movie myth, we can't just, wave a magic wand and make these devices disappear. We have to look at what trying to confiscate them looks like in the real world.
Oh, the logistics are wild.
Because if they aren't silent assassin tools, who is actually buying them?
Well, the market data from the NSSF shows us that millions of everyday law-abiding citizens are buying them. Right now, there are an estimated 4.2 million lawfully owned suppressors circulating in the U.S.
4.2 million.
Yeah, and that number is climbing rapidly. In just one single month recently, April, I believe, there were 128,000 applications filed to acquire them.
Hold on, applications. Like if I want to buy a car muffler, I just go down to the auto parts store. Why is there an application process for a gun muffler?
Oh, because suppressors are heavily regulated under a piece of legislation from 1934 called the National Firearms Act, or the NFA.
Oh, okay.
You don't just walk into a sporting goods store, pull one in your cart, and walk out.
Sure.
To buy one legally, you have to submit fingerprints, provide passport photos, pay a special $200 federal tax stamp, and go through an exhaustive background check by the ATF.
Wow, so it's a massive process.
It often takes months to clear. And because of that tax stamp, the exact registry of who owns them is considered protected federal tax data, which is why the industry estimates put the active number at around 4.2 million rather than having an exact public count.
Okay, this is where the logistical reality of the HERE Act just completely breaks down for me. The bill includes a 90-day surrender clock, meaning if the bill somehow becomes law, citizens have 90 days to hand over 4.2 million federally registered devices. Let's just do the mental math on that.
It's staggering.
If the government tried to recall 4.2 million cars in 90 days, it would be sheer logistical chaos. You'd have lines stretching for miles at every dealership, paperwork systems crashing, total gridlock.
And that's just for cars.
Exactly. Here, you're asking a federal agency to process the physical surrender, verification, and potential compensation of millions of heavily regulated items in 3 months. Is a bill with an arithmetically impossible enforcement window meant to be actual policy, or just a political statement?
Well, it is an arithmetical impossibility.
Yeah.
The burden of that timeline falls entirely on the citizens who already jumped through the incredibly stringent months-long federal hoops to acquire them legally in the first place.
Right.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, That logistical nightmare is actually just a speed bump compared to the constitutional brick wall this bill faces.
Let's talk about the Supreme Court then. Because this isn't just an administrative headache, it's a massive constitutional legal fight.
It really is. In 2008, the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision in District of Columbia v. Heller.
Heller, okay?
Yeah, that case fundamentally changed how firearms and their accessories are viewed under the law. And it established a very specific legal metric known as the in common use test.
Meaning, if a significant number of law-abiding Americans own an item for legal reasons, the government cannot simply ban it. Am I getting that right?
That is the core of the ruling, yes. The court decided that arms and accessories which are in common use by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes are protected by the Second Amendment.
Okay, so apply that test to the data we just discussed. You have over 4.2 million of these devices in circulation.
Right.
And 128,000 Americans applying to buy them in a single month. Overwhelmingly for the lawful purpose of hearing protection at the shooting range or while hunting.
Exactly. By any standard legal metric, 4.2 million heavily vetted owners absolutely clears the threshold of common use.
It seems like it would be nearly impossible to argue in court that these are rare, unusual, or strictly military devices.
Very difficult, yes.
Okay, so the HERE Act fails the 2008 Heller test right out of the gate. But the legal landscape has shifted significantly since 2008, hasn't it? Like, what happens when we apply the Supreme Court's modern, even stricter standards to this ban?
This is where we look at a much more recent Supreme Court case from 2022. New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen.
Bruen, got it.
And it's important to clarify here, when legal analysts apply Bruen to the HERE Act, they're making a projection based on the current legal framework. It's not a guaranteed prophecy of how 9 specific justices will vote.
Sure.
But that framework is incredibly rigid. Bruen fundamentally altered the way courts evaluate gun control laws.
How so? Like, why is it a higher hurdle than Heller?
Well, before Bruen, courts often used a 2-step process where they weighed the government's public safety interest against the constitutional burden. Bruen threw out that balancing act entirely.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, the Supreme Court dictates that modern firearm regulations must align strictly with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation.
So the courts literally have to look backwards in time?
Yes. They look primarily to the founding era, around 1791 when the Second Amendment was ratified, or sometimes to the Reconstruction era in 1868.
Okay.
The legal test is, did the founders, or the people of the 19th century, have a historical analog for this specific kind of regulation?
Wait, so what does this all mean? If there were obviously no suppressors in 1791, doesn't applying an 18th century standard to a 20th century invention create an impossible, almost absurd hurdle for any modern safety regulation to pass?
You've just articulated the exact critique that many legal scholars have lobbed at the Bruen decision.
It just seems so anachronistic.
They argue it creates a seemingly insurmountable wall against regulating modern technology.
Right.
But whether legal scholars like it or not, it is the law of the land right now. The reality is, the firearm suppressor was invented in the early 1900s. There is absolutely zero historical tradition from 1791 of the government banning a physical device that simply muffles the explosive crack of a firearm.
So, under a strict reading of Bruen, the absence of that historical analog is basically fatal to the regulation.
Exactly. Which brings up a really good point about the bill itself.
Yeah, which brings me to a really cynical question. If you have a proposed piece of legislation that requires an arithmetically impossible logistical timeline to enforce, clearly violates the 2008 Common Use Test, and runs headfirst into the brick wall of the 2022 Historical Tradition Test, why on earth are lawmakers even writing it?
Because it operates as what political analysts call a statement bill.
A statement.
Yeah, in a divided government, say, a Republican-controlled House, a bill like this is highly unlikely to ever see a floor vote, let alone pass.
Right.
The sponsors and their legal teams are acutely aware of these constitutional projections. But statement bills serve a totally different function. They signal priorities to a voting base.
Ah, I see.
They keep a specific policy conversation alive in the public sphere. They exist to say, we hear your fears, and we're proposing the most aggressive solution possible, even if that solution is legally unworkable.
Okay, but we can't just throw our hands up and say, well, it's legally unworkable, so let's do nothing. We have to look at the genuine public safety concerns that prompted the bill in the first place.
Absolutely.
Because the tragedy of Virginia Beach happened, the witness confusion happened. In an active shooter scenario, response times matter. Fractions of seconds matter.
They do.
So if a blanket ban on 4.2 million devices is a constitutional non-starter, what is the actual alternative? Like, how do we address the safety aspect?
That is the crucial pivot in the policy debate. If the genuine goal is to save lives and improve response times in mass casualty events without triggering a constitutional crisis, there is an entire alternative menu of reforms.
Okay, like what?
Well, instead of spending immense political capital trying to confiscate millions of devices from law-abiding citizens, you keep the device legal, but you invest heavily in the environment.
Invest in the environment. What does that mean practically?
You invest in advanced acoustic detection technology for public buildings that can instantly pinpoint the location of a gunshot, whether it's suppressed or unsuppressed.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah. And you invest in specialized training for first responders so they understand the different acoustic signatures of varying weapons and accessories.
So you focus on the environment and the response infrastructure rather than the muzzle of the gun. But what about the fear of bad actors getting their hands on them?
You address that fear at the point of access. You focus on rigorous point-of-sale background checks and tightening the mechanics of transfers, rather than issuing a retroactive blanket ban that instantly turns millions of currently compliant citizens into federal felons overnight.
That makes sense. You know, what strikes me the most when diving into this data is how uniquely, stubbornly American the specific standoff is.
Oh, it really is.
If you pull back and look at the international landscape, the entire cultural framing of this device completely flips.
It is a total inversion of the narrative. When you look at countries with deep hunting cultures like Norway, Finland, or across much of Europe, suppressors are viewed through an entirely different lens.
Right. They aren't seen as the sinister tools of Hollywood assassins.
No, not at all. They are considered the polite, responsible, almost mandatory choice.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and wondering, why would anyone outside a combat zone actually need one of these? The answer in Europe is simply manners.
Manners, exactly.
If you are going hunting in a Norwegian forest, it is considered basic etiquette to use a suppressor. You do it so you don't permanently damage your own hearing, you don't deafen your hunting dogs, and you don't disturb the neighbors who live near the woods.
It's an accessory of courtesy. They are lightly regulated, and in some areas over there, entirely unregulated.
It's wild to think about.
What's fascinating here is they frame it exclusively around hearing, health, and environmental noise pollution. And bringing that perspective back stateside exposes a glaring, almost incomprehensible contradiction in domestic U.S. policy.
Oh, the OSHA contradiction.
Yes. Consider OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA mandates strict hearing protection in the workplace.
Right.
If a factory floor, an airport tarmac, or a construction site exceeds a 90 decibel average, the federal government legally requires employers to provide physical hearing protection.
Yeah.
Or they face massive fines and shutdowns.
Hold on. So the federal government, through OSHA, will literally shut down a business to protect workers from 90 decibels of noise.
Yes.
But if a hunter or a sport shooter tries to use a physical safety device to lower a 160 decibel gunshot down to 130 decibels to protect their ears, a different branch of that same government wants to make them a felon.
Yep.
That is a wild contradiction. We mandate ear protection for the construction worker, but seek to criminalize the exact mechanical equivalent for the firearm owner.
But, to play devil's advocate here, isn't American gun culture so fundamentally different from Norway's that comparing their suppressor laws is kind of comparing apples to oranges? It's a fair pushback. The context of violence in America obviously shapes that legislation. In the U.S., the baseline rate of gun violence casts a shadow of fear over any accessory attached to a firearm.
All right.
But from a purely physiological and policymaking perspective, regulating the acoustic safety device doesn't address the root cause of the violence. The argument from the hearing protection side is that human hearing damage is cumulative and permanent.
Yeah.
You shouldn't penalize the physical health of millions of lawful operators because of the actions of violent criminals, especially when we've already established that the device doesn't actually make the gun silent anyway.
And it all loops right back to that decibel reality. We are debating a massive piece of legislation based on a fundamental public misunderstanding of the physics involved.
Exactly.
I mean, we started this deep dive looking at the sincere, valid public safety concerns driving the HERE Act. But when we fact-checked the science, we found that suppressed gunfire is still a 130 decibel jackhammer. It is not a movie whisper.
And from that physical reality, we ran into the staggering logistics. An active market of 4.2 million devices governed by a strict NFA tax process, paired with an arithmetically impossible 90-day surrender window.
Which led us straight to the constitutional cliff. The Supreme Court's 2008 Heller decision protecting items in common use, and the 2022 Bruen decision requiring a historical analog from the 18th or 19th century, creating an impossible test for a device invented in the 20th century.
The big takeaway here is that whenever you see fiery political rhetoric around firearms, it pays to look past the sentiment of the speeches. You have to engage with the raw mechanical data and the historical legal frameworks, because policy almost always fails when it attempts to regulate a myth instead of a machine.
I couldn't agree more. Which brings me to one final provocative thought for you to mull over. Our sources briefly mentioned something absolutely fascinating about how this entire century-long debate got started.
Oh, the branding aspect.
Yes. It essentially comes down to a 1900s marketing word. Think about the power of branding for a second. The original inventor of this device was a man named Hiram Percy Maxim.
Right.
In the early 1900s, he patented his invention and chose to market it under the brand name Maxim Silencer. It sounded slick, it sounded futuristic, and it sold really well.
It was a brilliant, evocative sales pitch for the era.
But imagine if he hadn't done that. Maxim also worked on technology for the early automobile industry, which was developing at the exact same time. What if he had looked at his firearm invention and simply decided to call it a gun muffler?
Because mechanically, physically, that is exactly what it is.
Right. If we had spent the last 120 years calling these devices gun mufflers, would we even be having this debate? Would a century of legal panic, Hollywood assassin tropes, and bills like H.R. 9208 even exist today?
Probably not.
It is entirely possible that a century of intense constitutional debate and the potential criminalization of millions of citizens hinges purely on one man's century-old marketing gimmick.
A single word that built a myth so powerful, the legal system is still desperately trying to catch up to the physical reality.
Just something to think about the next time you see that spy creeping down the dark hallway in a movie and the gun goes PFT. Thank you for joining us today for this deep dive. We'll be back next time exploring the rhetoric and reality of another one of the world's most complex topics.